And so we've been studying for a few weeks now the movie The Shack. Has anybody seen the movie since we started the series? Anybody? Has it enticed anybody to see it? Okay, well, a few people. Excellent. It's not a movie that we necessarily say, hey, you know what? We agree with all the doctrinal principles of it. All right? Because that's where you get a lot of Christian debate and things, you know. What I always say is you take the good, you leave the bad. And what this movie can do is it brings up great theological questions. Great theological questions that ultimately can provide healing for the soul. Because as we've been talking the last few weeks, is Mackenzie, who's the main character within the movie, is really struggling with God. And any parent or believer or unbeliever would, just because you're a believer, it doesn't make it easier. His struggle with God is because his little girl was kidnapped and eventually killed. And so he is on a path to reconcile with God. And God meets him in the person of the Trinity and begins to speak to his heart. And Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all have these interactions with Mackenzie in order not just to explain, because some of it just doesn't get explained, but in order to show that sometimes the Christian faith, the Christian walk, doesn't make it easier. In fact, the question I get most as a pastor, the number one question I get the most as a pastor, and that's what I put right on your sermon outlines if you're following along, is why are you doing this to me? Why is this happening? Why is God allowing this to happen to me in my life right now? Is it because I'm not a believer? Is it because I'm not a good Christian? Is it because of that sin that I committed? Is it because God doesn't love me? Is it because God doesn't care? And we ask over and over because there's somewhere in our mentality that, well, if we're a believer in Jesus and we're his child, then ultimately he should take care of us, which ultimately leads to and means that things should work out the way I expect them to work out, the way I expect it to take place. And that's not always the case. You see, the more and more I study and go through life as a parent, and some of you can attest to this, is there's some things in life that you as an adult or as a parent understand that your kids don't. And so when my kids were 3 and 4 years old, you just put them up on the counter and they're sick, and you're like, listen, I got to give you this medicine. And they're like, no, I don't like it. In fact, my kids have bad allergies. They got some bug bites the other day, and so some of my kids are walking around like Cyclops this morning, all right? They got their eyes swollen up, and what I'd do is I would put them up there because I'd have to give them some Benadryl or Zyrtec, and they were like, no, I don't want this, and you have to do it. No, I don't like the taste. You have to do it. And the question would always come, why are you doing this to me? And I would try to explain to them, like, buddy, or my little girl, sweetie, I'm not doing this to you. I'm doing this for you. You know, there's times in life where we don't quite get it. We don't quite understand why God is allowing us to go through some of the things that he's allowing us to go through. And it's not that he's doing it to us, but sometimes he's doing it for us. But right then, all we can do is taste the bad medicine. All we can do is taste what's there and present, and we don't understand the effects because it's only God who is sovereign who can see all things. It's only God who knows the future, and that's where we walk step by step in faith with him, believing and trusting that our good God knows the future, and he's going to work this out somehow in some way. But we often ask this question, why are you doing this to me? And God says, I'm not doing this to you, I'm doing this for you. Sometimes God comes and says, I'm doing this with you, and he partners with us and entices us and emboldens us and strengthens us as we go out, but it doesn't always make it easy. And so as Mackenzie is wrestling with this, why are you doing this to me, God? There's a short little clip from the movie that I want to show you where he has this interaction with Jesus, much like our story this morning that we're going to be talking about with Peter and Jesus out on the water.
Mack, it's okay.
Why are you doing this to me?
This isn't me.
You told me to come out here.
Mac, this is happening inside you. You're letting it consume you and you don't have to. Just take a deep breath and listen to my voice.
As we see from the video clip, as we see that Mack is out there in the water and his boat's about to go under, Jesus walks out and says, this isn't me. This isn't me doing this to you. It's happening within yourself. Yes, he's allowing it to happen, but sometimes we need to go through some things in life that God knows is going to be better for us. Sometimes he doesn't just remove the conflict. He doesn't just remove the storm. What he does is he says, listen to my voice. It's not happening to you. It's not him. Because there's things that take place. When things happen to us, what do we often wonder? Am I doing this? We often wonder, did I cause this to happen? And there's some sins which we do cause to happen. There's some things that we did in our past that still the consequences come up today. There's some things that we end up sabotaging ourselves. But there's sometimes that other people sabotage us. There's sometimes other sins that happen to us and it gets caused to us because it's the effect of living in a sinful place, in a sinful world, in a sinful time. And so here in our story, we see Peter begin to wrestle with this. We see Peter out there in the storm, and here I want to show you something because it's very easy to miss it. It's very easy to miss it in this story because it's so easy as we read this story over and over and over again to just say, well, all we do is got to draw closer to Jesus and Jesus will, give us faith. And why didn't Peter have enough faith? And why didn't Peter, and we ask all these questions, so it's so easy to miss this, but there's something that stuck out to me as I read this story. There's something that stuck out to me as I heard it, preached by different pastors, and I just engulfed myself in the story, and it's easy to miss. And it starts out with verse 22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. While he dismissed the crowd, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Now, if Jesus knows all things, why is it that Jesus would send them off knowing that there was a storm coming? Why is it that Jesus would say, you go out on the lake knowing there was a storm, and then him go up and pray? You see, it's crazy to think that Jesus would send them out into a storm. It's crazy to think that Jesus actually said, go on over to the other side of the lake. That was a direction by Jesus. And he didn't say, oh, by the way, there's a storm, but don't worry, I'll handle it. No, he didn't go out and say, you know what, maybe I should go with them because they might get scared. No, Jesus actually allows them to go and sends them out, gives them the command to go out while he goes up and prays, knowing that there's a storm coming on its way. And I want you to get that because it's so easy to see or feel like God doesn't care when we're going through tough times. But the truth is, sometimes just because something's tough doesn't mean it's not of God. Just because sometimes things are difficult, just because sometimes we have conflicts up in life, doesn't mean that it's not of God. It's so easy to say, well, Satan's doing this and it's not of God. But God allows some things to happen and we have to admit that and we have to wrestle with it. And we can't put our Christian hat on with everybody else and say, well, it's because you're a sinner that this is happening in your life. Because sometimes God allows us to face difficult challenges. In fact, over and over in the Bible, people face difficult challenges all the time because it grew and it helped their faith. And so he's not doing it to them. Sometimes he's doing it for them. Amen, right? And so Peter's out there on water. And verse 25 says, shortly after dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. You see, Matthew says that they sent him off, but, even there's three different accounts of this written by three different people. Matthew, Mark has one. So in Mark 6, I just want to show you what Mark says about it. Mark 6, verse 48, if you want to flip there. And here, Mark just takes a little bit different twist on it, and it's so interesting to see what he says. Later that night, in verse 47, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars. So he's up on land on a mountain, and he's looking down at this lake, and he's seeing the disciples strain. You see, sometimes it feels like God is at a distance from us when we're going through these storms. But God is looking straight at us and knowing exactly what's going on in his life. He's not blind, he can see. He's not distant, he is near. And he's staring at them straining at the oars, which shows over and over again that just because we're going through something difficult doesn't mean that God is absent. God is present. And he was straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Sometimes it can feel like everything's against us. It can feel like the finances are against us. It can feel like our family members are against us. It sometimes can feel like our spouse is even against us. Sometimes it feels like there's so many things against us. And I want you to see this morning, just because sometimes things are against you doesn't mean it's not of God. Why is God doing this to me? And the disciples could think the same thing. Shortly after or before dawn, he went out to them, waiting, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them. When they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. Notice that. It says he was going to pass them by. They're out on the lake, and Jesus comes walking out, and he was just going to keep walking to the other side. Like, they're sitting there rowing, and they're straining, and they're struggling, and he was just, oh, hi guys, and he was going to keep going. I find that kind of humorous that Mark is what he's saying. It's Jesus went out there. He made himself available. He made himself present. But it wasn't until there was an initiation of faith. It wasn't until there was an actual action taken by the disciples that Jesus redirected where he was going. He was going to the other side. He was out there present, available, but he was going in a certain direction. And it wasn't until the disciples actually said something that he was willing to change his direction and change his mind. And I think he did it the whole time. I don't think he actually changed his mind. I think he knew what he was doing. It's like where a parent stays kind of around the corner and peeking at your kids, just waiting for them. You know they're in trouble. You know they're going to need help with something. Maybe they need to tie their shoes. You know it, and he's just waiting. And so Jesus was going to the other side and actually waited. In verse 27 in Matthew, it says, but Jesus immediately said to them when they were afraid, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. You see, at different times in life, it feels like we're going to sink. If you're taking notes this morning, I want to talk to you about going down. I want to talk to you about going down. That's point number one, going down. Because it sometimes feels like we're drowning. In fact, the Bible tells us in different passages that it's going to feel like we're going to drown. In Romans 3:23, it says, for all have fallen short of the glory of God. In Romans 6:23, it says, for the wages of sin is death. And so there's going to be times in our life where we feel like we're drowning, where we step out in faith and then we begin to sink, where we step out and be courageous and say, yes, Jesus, I want you, save me. And then it feels like we're going down under. You know, Jesus allowed Peter to step out on the boat knowing what was going to happen. Peter steps out in faith and then begins to sink. And it just amazes me over and over again that Peter was willing to actually take the steps. Peter was willing to say, okay, I'll go to you. But then something happens. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on water, came toward Jesus, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. You see, he first started out great. When we become Christians, we're saved, we feel great, things are going great, right? We feel like God has just taken a whole burden off of our shoulders. I was talking to a lady on Tuesday night who had just given her her life to the Lord the previous Sunday. She was there at Tuesday Bible study, and she'd come through faith. She'd come through faith, come to faith. And we were talking, and she says, man, it's like the last 3 days, my whole perspective has changed. The last 3 days, my whole life has changed. And I just wanted to be able to kind of tell her, like, that's great. That's awesome. You know, the angels are celebrating with you in heaven. You know, God is smiling. You know, your whole world is being opened. You're like a new baby believer coming to life. But what's going to happen 5 years from now? I just want to prepare you. If I could give her some advice, it's wait 10 years from now and just, you know, you're alive right now and that's good. But anybody who's weathered a couple storms, you kind of know, right? It's not the amount of faith you have. It's not the capability of having faith. It's not the amount. You see, so many people, and I think we get this wrong, there's so many people that say, well, it must be the amount of faith. If I just had a little more faith, God would answer that prayer. If I just read my Bible a little more, if I just prayed a little more, if I just spent a little more time serving, then God would just change everything in my life. It's not the amount of faith. Because where are the other 11 disciples? Back in the boat, right? Peter was the one that was willing to get out. Peter had more faith than the other 11. Peter had faith. It's not the amount of faith. This is where people get it wrong so much times. Say you just got to have more faith. It's not about the amount of faith. It's not about faith being available. Sometimes faith needs to run the distance. Because he was willing to get out of the boat, but when he saw the waves and the wind, what happened? He was distracted. He looked away. You see, and it's not that he didn't have faith, and this is where we say, oh, because Jesus said you have little faith. I don't think Jesus was talking about the amount of faith Peter had. I think he's saying, Peter, why did you lose your faith in that moment? Peter, why did you begin to doubt? Peter, if you just had a little bit of faith, he says, a little bit of faith can move entire mountains. The faith of a mustard seed can change your world and change your perspective. So it's not the amount of faith. It's that sometimes when things get in our way of our expectations, sometimes when challenges come, sometimes when the storm seems to be bearing down and we're going through the middle of it, it's hard to keep your faith. We begin to remove our eyes from Jesus or the direction we're going, and we begin to look at all the problems. And when we look at all the problems and all the negativity, what does it do? It zaps our energy. When we look at everything else around us that seems to be weighing us down, it just immediately, we're exhausted because it's too much for us to bear. And sometimes what happens is God is allowing us to go through that storm. He's allowing us to go through that too much to bear in order for us to see, in order for us to grow, in order for us to find something that we never would have looked for before without that storm. You see, it's only when you can look back at that storm and you can begin to appreciate it. I was talking to somebody yesterday as we were sharing some stories, and they were telling me some stories of where they've gotten stuck out on a boat, and we were out on a boat with them, so I was getting a little nervous. And they were saying, yeah, we've been out there, and times we've gotten beached, and we're there for 8 hours, and I'm going, oh my goodness. And they're telling me this story, and they're just laughing. He's like, yeah, I was out there pushing, and it was night, and I could have gotten eaten by sharks, and he's just laughing about it. And I'm going, man, at the time, you probably weren't laughing, were you? No, I was cussing. I was angry. I was mad, And of course, because when we're going through the storm, it's only when we can look back at that storm that we can say, oh, I get it now. Oh, I understand now. You know what? I might not understand why I went through that storm, but I certainly did grow through that storm. I might not understand all the perspectives about that storm, the precipitation, the amount of water, but I can certainly tell you this. I knew what I did during that storm, and it got me through, and God got me through, and it increased my faith, and man, I am a better person today because I went through that storm. It's only when we go through the storm and we can look back that we can appreciate the storm. I've walked with some people who have had some financial struggles before, and they were in some lawsuits. And man, when they were going through court systems and contracts and everything, they were so angry. It consumed their family life. It consumed their marriage. It destroyed everything around them. Because, the angerness and the bitterness, the inner conflict of the storm can often wreck us. It can leave some damage and destruction. A hurricane hits, and what's it do? It leaves behind some damage and destruction. And those inner conflicts of life can surely mess some things up. And as Peter stepped out on that water and he begins to look at the waves and the wind, and he gets nervous because he realizes, man, I can get hurt in this. Man, what can I lose? I can drown in this. You see, Peter had enough faith to get out of the boat, but still, we start to walk, and then as soon as we get into the storm, we start to change our perspective. We start to turn our eyes from where we were going and start to put them on all the negativity around us, all the problems. And we just want God to fix it. God, why aren't you fixing it in this moment? And Peter begins to sink. But when Peter begins to sink, what happens? And this is the grace in the story. When Peter begins to sink, he cries out, Lord, save me. And so Jesus, who was walking from one end to the other, Jesus, who was moving a certain direction, he ends up seeing his loved ones struggle, his disciples struggle, and he stops and he pauses for a moment in order to see if they're going to react. And they do. They get scared. And when anyone is ever scared, guess what? God is always near. He can draw near to us at any time. And because they're scared, Jesus makes himself available, knowing their feelings and their fears. And so Jesus is there and he says, it's a ghost. No. Take courage. It is I. Peter takes courage. That's faith. He gets out on the boat. He begins to walk and he becomes distracted and he begins to sink. And that happens like this in our life. It's like a roller coaster. We're going up and then we go down. And we go up and we go down. And it's in those valleys. It's in those moments where your faith is really, really tested. It's in those valleys and the ditches where Jesus says, are you going to trust me? And sometimes we begin to sink because our focus is distracted, and we're distracted that we should be at the top of the mountain. We're distracted because it should be going differently. We're wondering why God is doing this, and we begin to question, why are you doing this to me? And it's in the valley where he begins to sink. But Jesus reaches down and grabs a hold of him. Jesus reaches down and says, just because you're going to sink doesn't mean I can't save you. He waits for Peter to say, Lord, save me, and reaches down and actually saves him. You see, Jesus is always waiting for us to respond. Jesus is always waiting for us to say, Lord, come into my life. Lord, I give this to you. Lord, I make this available, because where we can't do it, where we fall short, doesn't mean that Jesus ever falls short. Just because we can't reach Jesus doesn't mean that Jesus can't reach his hand down to us. Just because we can't reach up to heaven and get there by ourselves doesn't mean that God doesn't come down. We see it over and over. Philippians 2 said God came down in the form of a human being in order to dwell with his people, to be with his people, and to die for his people. Jesus Christ came down. God comes down. And so when we're sinking, when we feel like we're in the valley, God reaches down and he grabs a hold of us. Point number 2 is, look at me. That's what Jesus is waiting for. Everyone feels at times they're going down. But Jesus says, look at me. He grabs a hold of Peter's hand and he pulls him back to safety. He grabs a hold of Peter and says, listen, Peter, why did you doubt? Peter, keep your eyes focused on me. Don't focus on all those distractions. Don't focus on all those problems. And it's so easy to beat up Peter. Peter, the man of little faith. Peter, the one who didn't see it through. Peter, the one who lost hope. I'll never be like Peter, but anytime you're walking on water and a storm comes up, let me tell you, we'd probably often have the response of the other disciples in the boat, like, all right, you do it first. You show me how it's done. You get out there and start walking on the water, then I'll join you later. Right? Peter actually has the faith to get out on the water and begin to walk. And when he runs into a problem, what does he do? He says, save me. See, that's our response. We should always be asking God to save us. And God is sometimes waiting to step in until we ask him. Sometimes God is pushing us through a situation or in a situation waiting for us to ask to save him. And anytime we cry out, save him, guess what? Jesus reaches his hand in and he begins to work a miracle. He pulls us out. He begins to do things in our life. And it doesn't happen spontaneous. Sometimes it does. It doesn't happen all the time overnight. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it's a process. And he begins to pull you out, and then you're able to look back and say, oh, God was there all the time. God cared about me all the time. God had my back all the time. And so what I want you to see is not that you're not going to have problems. Not that there's not going to be storms. And sometimes the inner conflict of anger and resentment can sometimes ruin us. But Jesus just says, draw close to me. The closer Peter could get to Jesus, he was right there next to him when he had issues, right? The closer he got to Jesus and he began to sink, he made himself available for Jesus to reach down his hand and grab him and to pull him back. You see, anytime we cry out, Jesus, save my marriage. Jesus, save my family. Jesus, save my kids. Jesus, save my finances. Jesus, save me. And we open ourselves up to Jesus, we make ourselves available for Jesus to reach down and to pull him out. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He says, look at me. Keep your focus on me. Why did you look the other way? But when you do look the other way, yes, you're focused on the wrong things and you feel like you're going to drown. It's sucking the life out of you. You're sinking. But all you do is got to turn your eyes back to me and ask me to save you, and I will step in at any time and save you from whatever you're going through. I will save your life. That way death can't consume you. That way Satan can't interfere. That way nothing else has a hold of you besides Jesus. And when Jesus has a hold of us, that storm can't affect us anymore. When Jesus has a hold of us, that storm can rise up. It can try to. The waves can pound over us and beat on us. But guess what? Jesus is holding you tight, and they're standing on water. And the last thing I want to show you this morning, if you're taking notes, is point number 3, be on the boat. Be on the boat. Because I know there's people in here who have had experiences of storms. I've talked to you. I know there's people in here that feel like they've walked on water and began to sink, and Jesus grabbed a hold of them and pulled them back. But what happens after the boat? What happens afterwards, after that experience? And what amazes me is that Peter, again, had the faith beyond all the other disciples to actually get out of the boat. The other disciples are sitting there as the 11, and they're in the boat, scared. It's a ghost. And they allow Peter to go over. But the other ones stayed in the boat. And as long as you stay in the boat, you can stay in your bubble of security. Makes you feel safer. You stay in the boat and you feel like, God's calling to me. He says, come. And Peter actually comes and walks on water. Whenever God's calling to you, you know the call. When you feel it's from God, you feel it in your heart. It's something you're passionate about. He calls you to do it. But then insecurities are going to rise up. Insecurities are going to get in their way. And it feels like there's a storm in your life of conflict. I remember when God called me to move to Florida to plant this church. Man, there was some insecurities. I don't know if I'm good enough. I don't know if anybody will come. Every single Sunday morning when we set up, I turn on the microphones. I'm like, I don't know if anybody's going to show up this morning, and we're praying, and we just don't know. And insecurities come. And here's the thing about the boat. As long as you stay in the boat, you're never going to truly have experiences of faith with God, right? The other 11 disciples only experienced God through Peter's faith of getting out. That's why it so upsets me when people start to ridicule Peter. Well, Peter got out and walked on water, but man, he looked the other direction and boom, he began to sink. At least Peter had the faith and the guts to get out of the boat. At least Peter went to Jesus when he called him. He took steps of faith. And so I don't think we should be beating up Peter that he began to sink. Why don't we beat up the 11 who stayed in the boat? There's too many Christians who just sit in the seats today. There's too many Christians who know the grace of God, but they don't go out there and spread the love. They don't go out there and create peace. They don't go out there and shine that Jesus is in their life. They're sitting in the seats going, Pastor, give me a good word this morning. I hope the worship team is on game today. I hope the snacks at the refreshment table aren't out by the time we get out of our seats. What's for lunch after church? We come to Sunday and we forget about God Monday through Saturday. Am I preaching to anybody this morning? There's too many Christians who stay in the boat, and I don't want to just beat you up this morning, but I want you to see that Peter at least had the faith to come to Jesus when Jesus called. See, there's going to be times that we're scared. There's going to be times that we're frightened. But who do we need to be by? Is it the boat that's our security, or is it Jesus? Because as long as you're staying in the boat, the truth is you can create all these things that you think are secure. You got a savings account? Great. You're financially secure. Just wait until that pops. We all know that happens at times, right? It can get sucked away. Oh, my kids are healthy. My family's doing good. But just wait, and it changes instantly. Someone ends up with cancer, and we begin to questioning God. Because why? Our boat just began to sink because we put our security in the boat. But Peter had the guts and the faith to get out of the boat and begin to walk toward Jesus, because he knew, if I could get toward Jesus, if I could get close enough to Jesus, yeah, there might be some storms in my life, and I might begin to sink, and I might go through some hard times. But as long as I'm close enough to Jesus, then I can cry out to him at any time. And it's just like having a lifeguard with a life preserver right next to me. He can reach down and he can pull me up. And that's what Jesus does. I can't tell you how many times I've been in the pool with my kids, and as long as I'm holding on to them, they have all the faith in the world to do anything. It's when you let go, they begin to freak out because that insecurity's gone. As long as Dad's close by, as long as Dad's touching me, as long as Dad can feel me. See, that's the faith of Peter. It wasn't the amount of faith. It's that Peter needed to keep his faith. That's what Jesus was saying. Peter, keep your faith 10 years from now. Peter, keep your faith 15 years from now, because it's through these valleys that your faith is going to matter. It's not on the mountaintop. Everybody has faith when things are going good. It's through the valleys. It's through the low times. It's through the storms that you're going to need to have faith. And as long as we get close to Jesus when we're going through that and we begin to sink, we cry out and he steps in and he saves. You know, this week, a couple last stories. Sitting there and talking to my kids about studying. And it's amazing how people who have never done anything in life always have the advice for you to do everything, right? Have you ever experienced that? So my kid, who is in high school, going into ninth grade, we're talking to him about studying. He says, "Yeah, Dad, I know how college students study," because I'm explaining to him, listen, in order to be able to study, you need to do certain things like the rest of the college students. And he goes, "Dad, I know how college students study." "Yeah, really? You want to tell me? You want to explain to me how the one who's never been to college, the one who's never been around college kids during a test, and you're going to tell me that how college kids studies when I've done over 10 years of college, have a master's degree, and gone through all the years? Really, you're going to tell me how to study?" My daughter looks at me this week and says, "You know, Dad, let me tell you how to drive." So my 11-year-old who does not have a license, who has never driven a car, is going to tell me all about driving. Tell me how dangerous of a driver I am. Tell me how to keep safe when she's never driven a car. And you know what? That's true. Many people will say, "Hey, Pastor Chris, probably," I'm telling you, I'm one of the best and safe drivers, okay? If you know me. People always say, "Well, that's not true. You've had lots of accidents or whatever." Get in the car with my wife, and then you'll pray to God. That's what I'm saying. It's one of the reasons on one of the cars where we put the Source bumper sticker, the other one we don't, because get in the car with her, and you'll start praying for God to save you, right? She rides right on those people's bumpers, and I know some of you guys are like drivers like that. But my 11-year-old's going to sit here and tell me how it is to drive when she's never driven a car. People always have the advice for you who have never done anything. I mean, have you ever had someone tell you? I had someone tell me recently that, that these people now that we have these children, these people keep giving us advice on these kids. I had one person tell me that your daughter should be potty trained when she was a year old. And I kept telling my wife, because sometimes I got to calm her down when people say things, I'm like, "Hey, calm down. Don't worry. They don't have any kids. They don't understand. They just don't get it." You know what it's like when people start giving you advice who've never gone through anything. They just don't get it. Don't worry. And it's funny now because they had this thing thought process that when my kid was 1, they were going to be potty trained. Just wait, because when they have kids, that's God's payback. And so when they start having kids, me and her laugh now because we're like, well, let's see, their kid's 3. Are they potty trained? No, I thought at 1 year old they were going to be potty trained, I mean, people always have advice for somebody. That's what I want you to see with the disciples is the 11 disciples decided to stay in the boat. The 11 disciples sat in false security. The 11 disciples sat here going, you know what? I got my finances in order. I got good health. Things are going good. You step out for God. We'll see if it works for you. If it works for you, maybe I'll follow later on. But I'm good right here in my boat. This is my nice security net. Everything's going. I'm staying afloat. This is where I want to be. And it's Peter who actually had the faith to step out on the boat and began to walk to Jesus. It's Peter, the one that had the experience. The reason we're able to read this story today and benefit from it is because Peter had the faith to step out of the boat. So I'm asking you this morning, what faith is God calling you to? What are you doing in your life that's going to require some faith for you to step out on the boat? What mission is God calling you to that seems like it's bigger and you've never done it before? Because before that, Peter had never walked on water. Before that, no man had walked on water. For him to step out and have the faith that he's going to be able to walk on water to Jesus, what element in your life is maybe God calling you to that's going to take more faith than you can imagine? And it's not the amount of faith again, but the endurance of the faith. To begin to take one step out of that boat and then to take another and to take another, because it's through those experiences that you have. It's through those valleys. It's through the ditches. It's through you walking toward Jesus and him calling you and you taking steps toward him despite what storms and struggles and conflicts might come. That's what's going to grow your faith. And it's the faith that's going to endure for all time. It's the faith that's going to last. It's the faith that's not going to go away because God is growing you through your experiences. It's what God uses to shape a person. It's what God uses to chisel off the edges. And so just because you're going through some conflicts and maybe not everything's right in your life doesn't mean you don't have faith. Sometimes God might be calling you to stay into something that you might want to leave. Sometimes God might be calling you to actually grit your teeth and go through stuff that sometimes we just would rather give up hope and just walk away. More and more, if Christians decided to work together at their marriages, at their family, in the workplace, in the church, in the community. If Sunday wasn't forgotten on Monday and you were a transformation agent within your workplace, if people that you were around all the time knew by the way you lived that the light of God was shining through you, that Jesus was there next to them, through you and through your presence, how different would things be? You see, sometimes it's so much easier to not tell anybody about Jesus, to just stay in the boat, just stay comfortable, to stay safe. But what is God calling you to that's going to take faith? And if you want your faith to increase and to last and to grow, we need to be willing to step out of the boat and grow.